Chapter 4. The View from the Place of the Roaring Tiger, Tibet's Nameless Religion. It is often said that the present Dalai Lama comes from a humble peasant background, but this is not strictly accurate. According to family legend, his ancestors served as soldiers in the army of Tibet's greatest monarch, the 7th century king Sungtsen Gampo. Subsequently, they lived for many generations as nomads, herding their flocks from place to place before eventually settling in the regions of Taxa. By the time of the Manchu conquest of China and the Tibetan borderlands in the mid-17th century, the family had become relatively prosperous, and for the next 200 years that remained the case. But then, toward the end of the 19th century, disaster struck. The village was destroyed during a rebellion against Manchu rule, and the family, made destitute, was reduced to living in grinding poverty in the caves of the surrounding hills. It was not until one of its members was recognized as the reincarnation of a famous Lama that the family's fortunes revived. This was Taksur Rinpoche, the man with whom the Great 13th shared the picnic. He was also the great-uncle of the present Dalai Lama. Because of the continued danger, the young prodigy was taken as a child to Mongolia to be educated. There he gained a reputation as a great teacher and, returning home in middle age, is said to have brought with him a vast fortune, including 10,000 camels. This is surely an exaggeration, but as a result of their now famous scion's generosity, the Lama's relatives were able to buy back the land they had lost and to build a house that, in the words of one of the Dalai Lama's older brothers, was, quote, one of the best in the village, a new Chinese-style home that was large and spacious, end quote. The family into which the present Dalai Lama was born was thus one of petty landowners. They were not aristocrats, to be sure, but neither were they members of the very large class of people that was directly dependent on the monastic or aristocratic estates. Employing 3 servants, one of them Chinese, another Hu Muslim, they owned, quote, over 50 sheep, a number of yaks, and several zomo, end quote, which is a family cross between a yak and a cow. Entered from the lee side, the new Dalai Lama's family home was a miniature fortress built around all 4 sides of its internal courtyards, at the center of which stood a pole hung with prayer flags, bleached by the sun and torn by the constant breeze blowing in off the nearby mountain range. There were no windows in the outer walls, however, and the few internal openings were covered with rice paper, not glass. The southern wing of the house included a dog kennel and a sheep pen, while the northern wing contained the family chapel next to the best room, the room in which visitors were received, and the main bedroom. The east wing was taken up by the kitchen, which was divided into 2 equal halves and included the main living space. There was a large stove and a tub for water. One side of the space had a wooden floor, while the other was of compacted earth. The west wing served as a cow barn and stable, with a storeroom and a guest room adjacent. Yet it was not in the guest room, but in the stable, alongside the cattle, that the children were brought into the world. The first to survive was Sering Dolmo, a daughter born in 1917. She was followed by 3 sons, Tassur Rinpoche in 1922, Gyalo Thundup in 1928, and Lobsang Semten in 1933, before the precious protector, who was born, according to the Tibetan calendar, on the 5th day of the 5th month in the wood pig year of the 16th Rainpunch calendrical cycle, or July 6, 1935, according to the Western calendar. Up at cockcrow in the dark hour before dawn, mother to light the fire, father to take the horses to water, the family lived until they moved to Lhasa, where Lama Thundup was officially acclaimed the rugged but satisfying life of pastoralists everywhere. At the time of the boy's birth, the village comprised some 30 homesteads, and so we can assume had a population approaching 200. Because children in such communities were seen as a boon, not a burden, families tended to be large, while there was no question of grandparents moving out. Yet childhood was something of a contest with nature, and life tended to not be long. With no doctors within many days' walk, still less a hospital, it is a little wonder that of the 16 children the Dalai Lama's mother bore, only 7 survived into adulthood. Nonetheless, the elders recalled in his autobiography that he and his siblings lived, quote, a happy and contented life in our remote village, end quote, adding that they, quote, found it strange when the occasional travelers passing through found it necessary to express sympathy with us on account of what they perceived to be our hard lot, end quote. For food, the main staple was sempa, roasted barley flour made edible by adding either tea, milk, or chang, which is barley beer, and kneaded into small balls in a bowl. Another staple was potato, which featured at most meals, but legumes were scarce except in their brief season. There was fresh meat, though in the autumn months only, this being the time when the animals were ready for slaughter. For the rest of the year, dried meat had to suffice. The only exception to this rule was if a beast died unexpectedly. When an animal was brought to the table, it was honored by being consumed in its entirety. Everything that could be eaten was eaten. Anything not edible was put to use. The intestines, carefully drawn, were used as casings for sausage and stuffed with congealed blood in goblets of fat and sampa flour. Brains and brawn, tripe, liver, and lights or lungs were all washed, seasoned, and roasted. The lights were considered a special delicacy, while some of the tripe was set aside and used for storing butter. The kidneys, nestled in sheaths of fat, were cooked in the glowing embers of the hearth. The trotters, too, made good eating, while the horn was used for making glue. In the summer, raspberries and strawberries and bilberries could be picked with wild in the woods nearby, while from the family vegetable plot came radishes and other salad foods and wheat for milling. Peas were grown for fodder, and there was dairy produce aplenty. But above all, in this household there were baked goods in abundance, deep-fried cookies and plump loaves of bread, rolls, fat and butter and sugar and raisins, and sticky dumplings soft as pillows, all made in the Amdo style. Even today, family members recall with wistful pride the delicacies confections of the Gyeomyam Chinmo, literally the Great Royal Mother. Because the household economy depended for its health on the produce grown and the livestock reared, with the occasional sale or purchase of a horse, every storm rolling in from Kiri, the mountain in the shadow of which the village stood, was watched with apprehension. A single hailstorm could destroy the labor of many weeks, and the house had to be battened down every time. Yet, in spite of the frequent violence of the climate, sheep and goats, pigs, yaks, dry, or the female counterpart of a yak, and zhou lived alongside the horses in the family flock in symbiotic kinship. Apart from the weather, the winters were bitter and snow came often. The only natural enemies universally acknowledged were the wolf and the Huhu, bands of marauding men of the local Hu population. Though wolves rarely attacked people, a wolf pack could easily carry off a flock of sheep or, on occasion, bring down cattle and sometimes even horses. No surprise, then, that the man who came home with a wolf carcass was considered a hero, and wolf hunting was an important activity, though other predators, mainly foxes and lynx, were hunted as well. But the Huhu were more to be feared than any wolf pack. Descendants of Central Asia, traders who had settled in China during the Middle Ages, the Hu constituted the principal ethnic group, other than the Tibetans, settled in the region. Every so often they would conduct raids among the Tibetan community, scouring the countryside for plunder. Then as now, the Tibetans lived mostly in the more remote areas, while the Hu, still for the most part traders, were found in and around the larger settlements, notably Siling, where there was a large mosque. And while on the whole the Tibetans lived quietly off the land, the Hu were more directly exposed to the greater Chinese economy and were more restive, especially during the declining years of the Qing dynasty and then more recently during the Chinese Civil War, which broke out during the late 1920s. Conditions were harsh, and from time to time unrest led to looting. The situation was complicated by the fact that, following the fall of the Qing, the Hu elite had joined forces with the Chinese nationalist Kuomintang party. The Hu leader Ma Bufang was one of their number, and it was his soldiers who, not long before the birth of the Dalai Lama, had fought a battle with the Tibetans and slaughtered not only the combatants but their children too. Joseph Rock, the Austro-American explorer, writing in National Geographic, described how their little heads were, quote, strung above the walls of the Muslim garrison like a garland of flowers, end quote. Yet if wolves and marauding gangs were a perennial threat to the family's security, a threat in many ways still more serious was that posed by entities of quite a different order. This threat was described by the Dalai Lama's mother in her autobiography, where she speaks of the visits of a kirong, a type of ghost that can change its form at will. The first haunting, the mother recalls, occurred when she lay gravely ill. On this occasion, the kirong manifested as a young girl who appeared in a dream, but who remained visible after the Great Mother awoke. The dream girl held out a bowl of what at first sight seemed to be Chinese tea, but which turned out to be blood. As the patient tried to sit up in bed, the ghost, quote, slipped to the door, laughing all the while, and disappeared, end quote. On another occasion, the Dalai Lama's mother was sitting beside her ailing newborn. All of a sudden, she heard first the heavy footsteps of the kirang on the roof of the house, then the sound of its descending to the door and unlatching it. The kirang, she wrote, came in, quote, and stood beside me, end quote. Thinking that the ghost, the appearance of which is not described, could not harm her child, the Gallium Chinmo took the baby up in her arms. But then the lamps, which had just lit, flickered and went out. The next thing she knew, the child was crying on the floor, 10 feet away, though the quote lamps were once more lit, and I was still sitting upright. I was not aware how my child had got to the floor, end quote. For the next 14 days, the baby was severely ill, quote, his eyes swollen out of all proportion. He cried constantly, and nothing I could do would comfort him. In the mornings, I would notice bloody scratch marks in and around his eyes, and there were blood stains on his cheeks. 3 weeks later, his crying ceased, but he seemed lifeless. When he could finally open his eyes, to my horror, they had turned from brown to blue. He had become blind, end quote.